Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Chris Higgins, and I am joined by the wonderful Jeremy Kalbstein. And this afternoon, we're going to be talking about teaching without harm, trauma-aware anti-racism pedagogy. Really, the purpose of today is to talk about how we can build educator capability to facilitate some of those difficult conversations that we have in our schools and in our classrooms. And in particular, how can we do things like interrupt harmful speech and prevent it? How can we do so respectfully? How can we potentially de-escalate a situation if a situation happens? And thinking about how we do all of that in a trauma-informed way. So what we're hoping that you will get from this afternoon is to think about how you distinguish between disagreement and conflict and what is maybe actually polarization, stereotypes, prejudices, and racism. Thinking about how we communicate and how we can communicate for prevention and also for response, and hopefully some really concrete strategies and ideas and being able to apply those in a trauma-informed way. Before we get into it, though, a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording the session for those who aren't able to make it live. Many of you are able to make it live, but many are not. So we are going to record it for them and send through a recording. So most of the recording should just record myself and Jeremy and the screen. But just in case anything goes a little bit awry and you don't want to be captured on video, please feel free to turn your video off. There will also be an opportunity for questions at the end. So if you do have some questions, please feel free to hold them to the end. You can either direct them directly to myself or to Jeremy and just say that in the chat, or if you want them to just be open, that's also fine. The chat function is on, and we do have my wonderful colleague Alison here supporting us. So if you need anything or any comments or any questions as we go through, please also feel free to pop those in the chat as well. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands that we're joining from today. I'm currently on the lands of the Wurundjeri, of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to all of their elders, past and present. We also here at MacKillop, where I am, we acknowledge that these lands are unceded lands, and we also pay particular attention to the resilience of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we particularly hold in our mind the harms caused by colonisation, but acknowledging that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been here for over 3,000 generations of connection, of storytelling, and of ongoing resilience. I also want to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that might be joining us today. And if anyone would like to, you are more than welcome to also pop in the chat the lands that you're joining from this afternoon and acknowledge the traditional custodians of those lands. And I'm going to do this one very, very quickly for anyone who's not familiar with us at the MacKillop Institute, and hopefully you are, because you're joining a webinar hosted by us. So probably assuming you've seen it on our social media or in an email, a newsletter. So if you don't know us, we're part of much bigger MacKillop Family Services, a large not-for-profit working across Australia in every state and territory. And we work to support vulnerable children, young people and families in all of our communities. We are very lucky that we've got about 2,500 staff, just under that, and they all come from different backgrounds. We have educators, we operate schools and education engagement programs, we have social workers, we have psychologists, and we've been doing this work for just over 170, nearly 180 years. So we've learned a few things about trauma-informed practice and about child safety and well-being, and particularly in a school's context. So very excited to be able to share some of that today. I'm also joined by the wonderful Jeremy Kalbstein, who is the Director of Education at Click Against Hate. And if anyone hasn't come across Click Against Hate before, it's a wonderful website with thousands of resources that are freely available to educators and schools across Australia. purpose of Click Against Hate is to tackle some of that racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia that we see out there in Australia and also much broader than that, and making sure that we can work to prevent that and also to respond effectively to it. If you haven't checked it out, check it out. There's just amazing stuff on there. I have known Jeremy for a little while now, and he's doing amazing work here at Click Against Hate. But Jeremy, for anyone who doesn't know, has also got long background in education. He is an educator first and foremost. He was a digital technologies educator, I believe was vice president at one point of the Digital Teaching and Learning Association as well. He'll probably cover that a bit more in a second. But also, some people might not know, a children's author as well. So very passionate about being creative, about storytelling, and also about making sure that our children and young people can grow up in a safe world. Without any further ado, I will hand over to Jeremy, maybe let him say a little bit more that I might have missed about Click Against Hate and about himself, and then we'll be straight into the content of this afternoon's webinar. Jeremy, over to you. What have I missed about you and about Click Against Hate?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for that. Maybe just a little correction. I don't know about thousands of resources. That much.
Millions.
Yes, yeah, maybe million. No, it might be overstating it a little bit, but we go for quality over quantity, basically. But yes, look, I like to sort of tell people that I work at the intersection of education, well-being, emerging technologies, and storytelling. So it's kind of quite a niche area, and I love writing, so I'm trying to find a way to sneak that into any part of my life that I can. So that's probably the best way to respond to that lovely introduction of yours.
Beautiful.
So
Well, Jeremy, I'll hand over to you then, and I'll stop sharing screen, and then I'll let you take over so that you can pop up and share your slides as well.
fantastic, thank you. Okay, so after that lovely introduction from Chris, I'm going to sort of start by setting the tone for our time together today. The session, I hope, is designed to be calm, grounded, and practical. It's not about assigning blame, and it's not about adding more to everybody's already full plates. Instead, it's about exploring how small intentional shifts in the way we teach can reduce harm and increase safety for every student in our classrooms. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask everyone one thing, and that is, what if the way we respond to behavior is doing more harm than the behavior itself? So just take a moment with that. There's no need to put anything in the chat. Just simply notice what comes up for you internally. Again, this session isn't about doing more, which is also what we talked about in the previous webinar. It's about doing things slightly differently in ways that reduce harm and increase safety. So I want you to hold that question in the back of your mind as we move through today's content, because everything we explore will come back to it. In classrooms, we often assume that behavior is a choice. But what if it isn't? What if what we're seeing is actually a stress response? And what if, without meaning to, some of our responses as educators are making that stress worse? As teachers, we need to understand the impact of trauma on learning and behavior. And there's a growing body of research showing that when we understand trauma, we start to interpret behavior very differently. So today I want to walk you through 4 key ideas that underpin this work. So the first is behavior is not always a choice. Second, stress impacts learning. Identity impacts safety. And classrooms can unintentionally cause harm. When trauma and identity intersect, the impact is amplified. And that intersection is really at the heart of what we're exploring today. So let's start with this idea that behavior doesn't always equal choice. As trauma expert Bruce Perry reminds us, the brain is a use-dependent organ. What happens to children shapes how they respond. Not all behavior is the decision. Sometimes it's a nervous system response. So when we see behavior in the classroom, we're often seeing adaptation, not necessarily defiance. And that's a critical distinction, and it changes everything about how we choose to respond. The second key idea is that stress impacts learning. When a student's brain is dysregulated, it can't access higher order thinking. The parts of the brain responsible for reasoning, problem solving, and learning effectively go offline when the nervous system is in a state of threat. This is not a behavioral issue, it's a neurological, not talking very well there, reality. And it means that before we can teach, we need to help students feel safe enough to learn. The third idea is that identity impacts safety. Students are constantly scanning their environment, asking themselves, is it safe to be me here? And that question isn't always conscious, but it's always present. And it's important to recognize that students aren't just navigating physical classrooms anymore, they're navigating digital environments that can amplify bias, visibility, and harm. Increasingly, identity is being shaped and sometimes misrepresented through technology, algorithms, and AI. So the question of safety extends well beyond the four walls of our classrooms. And the fourth idea, which can be uncomfortable but is essential to acknowledge, is that classrooms can cause harm. Even well-intentioned practices can unintentionally exclude or shame students. This isn't about judging ourselves or our colleagues. It's about being willing to look honestly at the impact of what we do, regardless of our intent. When trauma and identity intersect, the impact is amplified. Think about it this way. Trauma affects the nervous system. Racism and discrimination represent identity-based threats. So when a student is experiencing both, the cumulative effect is far greater than either one alone. And this is why we can't afford to treat trauma-aware practice and anti-racism as separate agendas. They're deeply interconnected, and our approach needs to reflect that. Students don't just need to feel safe, they need to feel safe being who they are. Because a classroom can be calm, it can still feel unsafe. We often frame safety in behavioral terms, rules, routines, expectations, so on. But true safety also includes identity, culture, and voice. A student who feels they can't bring their full self into the room is not truly safe, no matter how orderly the environment appears. As educational researcher Gloria Ladson-Billings reminds us, effective teaching isn't about extra programs. It's about making learning relevant, meaningful, and empowering for every student. The idea of safety and identity sits right at the heart of that. So what exactly do we mean by trauma-aware practice? Well, let me be clear. This isn't therapy. I'm not a therapist. It's about how we teach. First, predictability. Predictable routines and structures reduce anxiety because students know what to expect. Second one is emotional safety. When students feel emotionally safe, their threat response lowers and they can engage with learning. The third one is co-regulation. This is the idea that as adults, our nervous system leads. Students borrow our regulation. So when we're calm, it helps them become calm or remain calm. And the fourth is a strength-based lens, which shifts our focus from deficit to capacity. Bruce Perry captures this beautifully with regulate, then relate, then reason. We can't reason with a student who's dysregulated. We need to help them regulate first, build the relationship, then we can engage the thinking brain. Now, I'd like to turn to anti-racism in practice. And I want to start by addressing a common misconception. And it relates to the previous webinar, and that is that anti-racism is not an add-on lesson or a one-off workshop. It's how we respond, how we include, and what we notice in our everyday interactions. As Zaretta Hammond explains, culture is the way every brain makes sense of the world. So when we ignore culture, we're actually making learning harder, not easier. Anti-racism in practice means actively interrupting bias, ensuring representation matters, and prioritizing voice and belonging. It's about interrupting harm in real time, not waiting for a formal complaint or a critical incident. And when these intersect, the impact is amplified. And these aren't separate agendas. If we ignore identity, we miss harm. If we ignore trauma, we misread behavior. Both lenses are essential. So here you can see the trauma-aware elements. Each of these is a practical, everyday tool that changes how we interact with students. And none of them require additional resources or programs. They only require a shift in perspective. Beverly Daniel Tatum reminds us that identity development is a critical part of adolescent growth. So if identity is central to development, it must also be central to how we create safe classrooms. The environments shaping student safety now extend well beyond the classroom, and they don't always treat students equally. So let's dive a little deeper into this side of things. So identity affirmation means actively recognizing and valuing who students are. Representation means ensuring students see themselves reflected in the curriculum and the classroom. Interrupting bias means noticing and addressing inequity in real time. Voice and agency means creating genuine opportunities for students to be heard. And equity-focused decisions means considering who benefits and who is disadvantaged by the choices we make. These aren't abstract ideals, they're concrete practices that we can embed into our daily teaching. And when we look at these anti-racism elements together, what becomes clear is that they all serve the same fundamental purpose. They communicate to students that they belong, that they matter, and that their identity is an asset, not a barrier. Because this isn't about perfection, it's about intention and consistency. And here's where it all comes together. In the overlap between trauma-aware practice and anti-racism, we find psychological safety, belonging, trust, reduced harm, and inclusive participation. But we also find digital environments because the online spaces students navigate, including social media, algorithms, and AI, are increasingly shaping both their sense of identity and their experience of safety. Again, these aren't separate agendas. They're two lenses on the same goal. So we need to create classrooms where every student can learn, grow, and thrive. So why does this matter more now than ever before? We're seeing new layers of complexity in the lives of our students. Algorithms can amplify bias. Artificial intelligence can distort identity. And harm can spread faster than ever through digital channels, which makes this work not optional, but essential. The stakes are higher, and the need for trauma-aware, anti-racist practice in our classrooms has never been more urgent. So I want to give you something simple yet practical. It's a model that you can use in real time, in the moment, when it matters most. It's called the CARE classroom model. So CARE, as you can see there, stands for calm, acknowledge, respond, and empower. Now, it's important to understand it's not a checklist. It's a lens for decision making. It's a way to translate everything we've discussed today and put into action right there in the classroom. So let's unpack that a little bit. The first element is calm. And the principle here is simple. As you can see there, regulate before you educate. Before we correct behavior, we regulate the moment. As Daniel Siegel puts it, you have to connect before you can redirect. Connection is what makes correction possible. In practice, this means using our tone, our pacing, and the physical space around us intentionally. It means leaning on predictable routines. It might mean lowering your voice instead of raising it, slowing your pace, or simply giving a student space. Because remember, students borrow our nervous system. When we're regulated, it gives them the best chance of regulating themselves. The second element is acknowledge. And this means we don't dismiss what's happening. We recognize it. Now, acknowledging is not the same as agreeing with the behavior. It's about acknowledging the experience. Something as simple as saying, I can see this is frustrating for you, can shift the entire dynamic. And there's an identity layer here too. The same situation might feel very different depending on a student's background, or even their lived experience, and whether they've felt safe in similar situations before. Zaretta Hammond reminds us that acknowledging students' lived experiences builds the trust needed for learning. This isn't about lowering expectations, it's about increasing access. The third element is respond, and the key word here is pause. Pause before reacting. There's a critical difference between a reaction and a response. A reaction is automatic, whereas a response is intentional. And in the classroom, that distinction can make all the difference. When we pause, we can ask ourselves, what's underneath this behavior? What's really going on? One practical example is to avoid public correction whenever possible. Because public correction often triggers shame, and shame escalates behavior rather than resolving it. So a quiet, private conversation is almost always anyway, more effective. As psychologist Derald Wing Sue has shown, small everyday interactions can either affirm or diminish a student's sense of belonging. So how we respond matters more than we might actually think. And the final element is empower. And this is about giving students back a sense of control and voice. So it comes down to those three things: voice, choice, and agency. When students feel they have some control over the situation, their threat response decreases. Something as simple as asking, would you like to try this now or after the break? Gives a student agency. It communicates respect, and it reduces the power imbalance that can trigger a stress response. The key idea here is that control reduces threat. And when we empower students, we're not losing authority. We're building the kind of trust that makes learning possible. What looks like defiance may actually be protection. So I want us to sit with that for a moment, because this single reframe can fundamentally change how we interpret and respond to student behavior. So what looks like defiance may actually be protection. Now, I'm sure most of you have, if not all of you, would have heard of these, the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses. And these are involuntary and they are biological stress responses. They're designed to protect us from perceived threats. They involve rapid physiological changes, including increased heart rate, cortisol, which is what controls your fight or flight response during stressful situations. And it also can increase your adrenaline. And they bypass, and that means that everything bypasses rational thought entirely. So for anyone who's not familiar, let's do a quick overview. So fight is about confronting the threat directly, and it can manifest as aggression, anger, or extreme assertiveness. Flight is about escaping, whether that means physically leaving or emotionally withdrawing. Freeze is immobilization, that sense of being stuck or paralyzed. And fawn is about appeasing or complying with the threat to avoid harm. And it's often developed in response to childhood trauma. In the classroom, these may appear quite differently from what we expect. So fight might look like defiance. Why are you targeting me? Flight might look like avoidance, whether of individuals, work, or simply leaving the room. Freeze might look like silence, shutdown, or refusal to even participate. And fawn might look like overcompliance, constantly helping others or the teacher, sometimes to their own detriment. And it's worth noting that these responses aren't always triggered by what happens in the classroom itself. A comment, an image, or even a manipulated piece of content online can trigger the same stress response as something happening in the room. As Bruce Perry explains, children's behavior often reflects their internal state, not their intentions. So the question we need to ask ourselves is not what's wrong with this student, but rather what's happening for this student right now. So what can we do? Well, let's come back to the care classroom model. So first, we've got calm. Before we correct behavior, we regulate the moment. We lead with our own nervous system. We then acknowledge. We don't dismiss what is happening. We recognize and validate the student's experience. And when we respond, we pause and choose our response intentionally rather than reacting automatically. And then finally, we give the students back a sense of control and voice. So these 4 steps aren't complicated, but they're powerful. And they work because they address what's actually happening for the student, not just what we see on the surface. So I want to emphasize something important here. Small shifts matter more than big strategies. We're not talking about overhauling your entire approach. We're talking about small intentional changes, using a neutral tone, being mindful of timing, choosing your language carefully. Consider moving closer to a student instead of calling out across the room. Try private redirection rather than public correction. Name the effort you see, not the deficit. Give students processing time before expecting a response. John Hattie has consistently shown that teacher-student relationships are among the most powerful influences on learning. And relationships are built in exactly these kinds of small moments. So here's a concrete example of what a small shift looks like in practice. So instead of saying, why are you doing this? Try asking, what's going on for you right now? Listen to the difference. One assumes intent, the other invites understanding. And that shift in language can completely change the trajectory of an interaction. So let me share a scenario with you to bring this to life. Recently, a manipulated image of a year 8 student named Zara was shared in a group chat. It had been altered using artificial intelligence to mock her appearance. It spread quickly, and although it wasn't discussed in class, she knew others had seen it. This wasn't the first time Zara had been targeted online or outside of school. In class, Zara was repeatedly talking back during discussions. When corrected publicly, she became more defiant and eventually refused to participate. From the teacher's perspective, this looked like disrespect and disruption. But the context tells us a very different story. Zara felt singled out. She had previous experiences of bias, and the public correction triggered a shame response. So Zara's automatic responses were fight, followed by freeze. And the behavior we saw in class wasn't just about the classroom, it was connected to something happening in a digital space. As Derald Wing Su explains, microaggressions are often subtle, but their impact is cumulative. It's not always one moment. It's the pattern that matters. Now, how could the care model be applied here? So the teacher could start with calm, using a lower tone, avoiding escalation. They could then acknowledge it by saying, I can see this feels frustrating. They would then respond and say, hey, let's speak privately. And then finally, empower Zara. How would you prefer to receive feedback? Same behavior, but a completely different interpretation and a completely different outcome. So I'd like you to take a moment now and reflect on this question. Where might harm be happening unintentionally in your classroom? Remember, this isn't about judgment, it's about noticing. It's about being willing to look honestly at our practices and ask whether they might be landing differently than we intend. Just take 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Don't need to share any answers or anything, but just notice what comes up internally for you. Now, we talked earlier about making a small shift, and I want to come back to that now. You don't need to overhaul everything. Start with one practice, one small shift, and that's all it takes to begin. Change doesn't come from overhaul, it comes from repetition. And it comes from making one intentional choice again and again and again until it becomes part of how you teach. So from here, I encourage you to plan around 3 simple questions. The first is, what will I try? This gives you clarity about the specific change that you want to make. The second one is, when will I try it? This creates accountability. It moves it from a good idea to an actual commitment. And the third one is, how will I know that it's working? So this is about measuring your success, noticing the impact and adjusting as you go. As Ibram X. Kendi puts it, the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and challenge it. And that work starts in everyday classroom practice. As educators, we aren't just teaching in classrooms anymore. We're teaching in an age where identity, bias, and harm can be amplified by technology. That's why the work we do through Click Against Hate focuses not just on awareness, but on how students navigate these realities safely and critically. So here comes a pitch. If you're looking for practical, student-ready ways to bring this into your classroom, that's exactly the work that we do. And I would love to connect with you about it. So let me leave you with a quick recap and an invitation to act, and then I'll give you a bit of a rundown of Click Against Hate. So we've covered 3 core ideas today. Behavior is communication, safety includes identity, and small shifts reduce harm. And here's what I invite you to do. Choose one student, change one response, and observe the difference. Because when students feel safe, they don't just behave better, they become who they were meant to be. So I want to thank you all for your time and attention today. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about Click Against Hate. So if you don't know anything about Click Against Hate, it is a free platform for every school in the country and will always remain free. We're not going to say it's free now and charge you later on. It's targeted towards students in years 5 to 10, and they're grouped 5 and 6 together, 7, 8, and 9 and 10. And it covers 4 key areas of stereotypes and prejudices, media misrepresentation, discrimination, and online hate. And there are 8 modules for each of those year groupings. As a teacher, you would use the platform to teach your students because we're dealing with sensitive topics, so we want the students to have that guidance and support. We don't store any student data, and you are still able to access whatever students input through the activities as a form of assessment or to identify any potential red flags. And that's sort of it in a nutshell, but I'm happy to tell you more about it if you would like to connect me using the contact details there. Or if you'd like to continue the conversation or explore how we can help your school. Would love to connect with you. Always happy to chat, so don't hesitate to reach out. And I look forward to hearing from you. And Chris, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you so much for that beautiful overview and for I love that calm framework. It's very straightforward, it's very easy to follow, and aligns beautifully with what I'm going to talk to now. And I'm also going to apologize in advance if anyone can hear my dog barking in the background. I have decided to have a work from home day, and she's just joined me, and she also really doesn't like seeing cats out the window, which is what's going on right now. So I apologize in advance if you can hear that. I'll just reshare my screen, and what I would like to cover is very much what Jeremy's already touched on, and some of those trauma and stress responses that we actually might see from our children and young people. And Jeremy spoke beautifully there around whether what you're actually seeing is protection. We don't often know what's going on for our children and young people and what's going on inside their mind. And many times they don't know what's necessarily going on for them at that point in time, just like we don't as adults. And I know from my earliest days of studying psychology at uni, not that I progressed with it, but often the mind was referred to as, the black box, which was the term at the time. And that idea that you can't see inside it, you can't see inside someone else's mind. All we can really see is the external stuff, the behaviors, which is why so often in different types of psychology we study and look at people's behaviors in order to try and understand the mind. And so I'm going to give a very brief introduction to what we talk about when we mean trauma-informed practice or being trauma aware. I think that it has grown in popularity over the years, and there can be some misconceptions and misunderstandings about what we mean. And, I know I've certainly had it when I've worked with different sectors and organizations and schools where I have responses where people go, oh, but every kid doesn't have trauma, or every young person doesn't have trauma. And that's not necessarily what we mean about being trauma aware or trauma informed. So, what do we think of when we hear the word trauma? And I just want people to pause and have a think about that for a moment. What do you think of when you hear that word trauma? What's really common for people, and I do this too, is to immediately think of incidents, single, maybe one-off incidents that can be traumatic. And often we think of ones that are either very seriously physically traumatic or very seriously psychologically or emotionally or spiritually traumatic as well. But we often tend to think of things that are maybe not very frequent, not necessarily ongoing and repeated or high in frequency, but usually low in frequency and kind of immediate. I think a really good example that I often use is like a car accident. A car accident where someone might have a serious physical trauma, or maybe sometimes we might talk about a sudden death or a sudden bereavement or a sudden loss and how that can be traumatic. But we don't often think about it being on a spectrum. We don't often think about something being traumatic that can actually not be so immediate or a one-off occurrence. It can be something that actually is ongoing and repeated and really high in frequency, but on its own and looked at in isolation might not immediately appear like it is a traumatic event. And so what we try and do here at MacKillop, and based on all of the trauma theory that has been around for a good 5 decades or so now, is we try to differentiate between what we mean by adversity, stress, and trauma. And so what we do is we talk about adversity as the event or the challenge. What is it that that individual, or maybe even groups of individuals, what is the challenge that they have been presented with or that has occurred? That might be like a single one-off event, or it could be something that is ongoing. It could be daily for that child or young person or adult. It could be, every other week. It could be something that has occurred multiple times, but sporadically. What is the event? and that's the adversity. Then stress is our body's response to it. Whether we like it or not, our body has automatic responses to situations, and it has automatic responses to adversity. And so when we talk about stress, we talk about those physical reactions. What's going on inside the nervous system? What's going on inside parts of the brain? And that, again, is for all of us, not just our children and young people. And then trauma is actually the long lasting impact and effects of that adversity. So stress can happen in the moment, it can happen once off, it could be repeated. But what are the long-term ongoing impacts of that? And those impacts for many of us can be something that stay with us for our entire life. They can be lifelong impacts. And one of the things that we probably also know and are well aware of now is that not all stress is bad. There is such a thing as positive stress. Positive stress can lead to really good resilience. It can build our skills. It can build our knowledge set. It can build our experiences and understanding of the world. For many of our young people, sitting an exam can be a really good example of positive stress. It builds those skills for the future. For some of our young people, that might not be the case. That might be that it's actually a really negative form of stress. So, how common is adversity for our children and young people in Australia? And remember, again, when we talk about adversity, we're talking about the challenge, the events, the things that have happened or occurred or are happening or occurring. Unfortunately, in Australia, there is a lot of adversity our children and young people are experiencing. And, we have some similarities to other parts of the world, but we also have some numbers that are actually ahead of other parts of the world. And, it is very unfortunate and we can be a bit of an outlier in some ways. We're probably quite aware of some of them. We're probably quite aware of some of the things that are happening for our children and young people in digital spaces, for example, and some of the unsafe things happening there. But we have some stats that I'm just going to show you quickly, which will give you a bit of an idea of some of the adversities that children and young people are facing. And there's some fabulous research out there as well from Mission Australia, who do an annual youth survey of thousands of young people, where we know some of the biggest concerns that our children and young people have are around social situations, peer situations, bullying, but also actually things like worrying about financial strain, worrying about homelessness, worrying about poverty, worrying about drug taking, worrying about the environment and the economy. These are actually persistent worries and concerns for our children and young people. But a landmark study was done 2 years ago now called the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study, or often referred to as the ACMS. Landmark study of its kind because it actually interviewed and surveyed thousands of adults from the age of 16 up to 65 plus. And I know we're talking about children and young people here, but I asked them about their experiences of children and young people, which gave us a really good intergenerational lens and generational lens as to what is happening across Australia now for many of our existing children and young people, 16 and above, but also over the last few years or even over the last few decades. And there was some very interesting insights from that, which is still being unpacked and the data is still being analyzed. But what we know, unfortunately, is the adversity and potentially trauma and the ongoing trauma of those adversities is actually quite prevalent in Australia. What we learned from that ACMS is that almost 1 in 3 of our children and young people have been exposed to some form of physical abuse. Almost 1 in 3 again have unfortunately been exposed to some form of sexual abuse. And what we also know is that that is very much a gendered phenomenon as well. It is prevalent across both boys and girls, but is particularly prevalent for our girls as well. It's 1 in 3 for girls, and it's 1 in 5 for boys. We also know that emotional abuse is quite high. Neglect is still quite high as well, 1 in 10. And one of the highest is actually exposure to domestic and family violence. What we also know from that data is that amongst our 16 to 24-year-old range is that quite a number of them, 40%, have actually been exposed to more than one of those forms. So around two of those. And, we're starting to get at that point up to close to, 1 in 2. And unfortunately, and even more concerningly, around a quarter, so 1 in 4, have actually experienced multiple forms of those, or maybe all of those. If we think about that in the context of our schools, if we think about that in the context of our classrooms, if you have a class of 30 students and that's 1 in 4 of them or 1 in 3 of them, we're starting to talk about 10 out of your 30 children sitting in front of you have potentially been exposed to really extreme forms of adversity and may be trauma impacted. That's currently sitting in front of you. 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 of them may have already experienced something really quite traumatic. That's also many of them may experience that over the next couple of years. So especially if you're in a high school setting, it might be happening for them right now. It may have already happened, or it could be likely to happen as well. And so coming back to some of those ideas that Jeremy mentioned and coming back to what we know about being trauma informed, it's that awareness that these things could be happening for our children and young people just because they don't tell us or just because we don't know or we don't see it. We don't necessarily know whether it's happening or not, but also the impacts of that, the physical, the physiological, the psychological, the spiritual and emotional impacts of what might be happening for our children and young people. But we add into that they are also younger. They are also figuring out the world. They're also figuring out their place, their belonging, their identity. They're also still growing and changing and developing. They might not necessarily have the level of understanding of their own body and their own responses to difficult situations. So, what happens for our children and young people when there is an adverse event? And that adverse event may very well be something that happens in our classroom. So, these were really extreme, in a sense, forms of adversity that might be happening for our children and young people. Many of those won't happen in our classroom right in front of us, but they may be happening for our children and young people in the world outside. And we might see the signs of those things in our classrooms. And something might happen in our classrooms that triggers that stress response. We know that all humans have a stress response. There is the kind of three oversimplified parts to our brain. If something happens, like there is some sort of racist comment in a classroom, or Islamophobic, or homophobic, or anti-Semitic, if there is something that might have trigger a stress response for a child, a young person, it's ultimately going to involve these three parts of the brain. And I do apologize that this is an oversimplification, and I do like to use the hand as well. And you might have seen this in other contexts or other professional learning or training sessions. But if we think about it, we've got kind of these three core parts to the brain. We've got the cortex, which is kind of this bit over the top here, which is the thinking part of the brain. It's responsible for all of our complex thought, our abstract thinking, our creativity, planning, some of our self-awareness as well. Then we've got the limbic part of the brain, which is this bit in here that the cortex covers over the top. And this bit is all of our kind of emotional regulation center. So that's things like our emotions, our self-regulation. It is our kind of watchtower. When we feel something, we feel it in here. And then we've got the brainstem, kind of this bit down down the bottom here, which is the bit that's responsible for, like Jeremy mentioned, those fight, flight, or freeze responses or fawn responses as well. It's the what we often call the mammalian part of the brain that's responsible for our automatic responses, like our breathing, our heart rate, but is also the bit that can trigger when something happens. Every single one of us, when we experience stress, ultimately it comes up through that brainstem, up through the mammalian part of the brain and into the amygdala, and then will cause what is often referred to as an amygdala hijack, where essentially our brain just becomes flooded with emotions and feelings. It goes back into the brainstem and triggers those automatic responses where we fight, we freeze, we run away, we fawn, and we might fight as well. But what certainly happens is we stop having access to the cortex. We stop having access to the thinking part of our brain, which helps us do reasoned thinking, helps us to process what's happening and why we might be responding the way we are. Essentially, when we stop having access to that part of the brain, it's only these two parts that are going on. And when those two parts are the ones triggered, it's very difficult to reason in that point in time. So how we respond to that situation is so crucial and so important. And so, like Jeremy has already mentioned, if something's happening for our children and young people, sometimes tackling it in that moment is not the time and place to tackle it, because the part of our brain that is rational and can engage in rational thought is not working right now. Yeah, it is these automatic parts of the brain that are working right now. So how we respond in that situation is crucial and critical. And that's what we mean when we talk about trauma-informed practice, is being aware of that, being aware of what can happen to our bodies when we're in a stressful situation where there's an adversity, something in classroom might happen, what's happening in our bodies, what's happening for that child or young person at that moment, and how do we then respond to that appropriately? And so, like again, Jeremy said, that really, really classic phrase in the trauma informed practice and theory is not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. Or even flipping that into the current is what's happening for you. So if we see a child or young person responding in a particular way, even if it at first might seem like it's a challenging way that they've responded, what is happening for them in that moment? And it may very well be that they are having a stress response. So all our parts of our body are physiologically involved in that moment. So when we're having the stress response, we might notice it in the eyes, our mouth, our skin. Really, any of our organs or part of our body is where we might notice it. And it's different for everyone. And it can be different for everyone. And our perception of it can be different for everyone. Have a think about when you're stressed, where do you feel it? Where do you feel it in your body? For some people, it can be the stomach. They might immediately have that sinking stomach feeling or the kind of butterflies feeling. For some people, it's the heart rate. The heart rate starts to go when they're starting to feel stressed. The heart rate goes up or it might go down. For some people, it might be sweaty hands and they start to get clammy. Some people get dry eyes and stingy eyes. Some people get a really, really dry mouth. So the saliva production goes down. Some people start over salivating. Some people get really hot and start to feel flushed. But it's essentially our amygdala and our brainstem reacting to that stressful situation and causing these changes in our physiological body. That might be the first signs that you are feeling stressed, or a child or young person is feeling stressed at that time. What are you feeling? I know with me, I can feel I'm starting to get stressed when I start to feel my heart rate go. My heart rate starts to go up and I immediately start to feel very hot. It feels like a hot flush kind of coming up through my body and towards my head. And I literally, the expression, feel my temperature rising. When I feel my temperature rising, I know that I am actually feeling really, really stressed in that moment. And I have to quickly try and regulate and think about what it is that I'm feeling and why I am feeling stressed in that situation. You are not necessarily going to notice that in your children and young people. You might be able to notice it in yourself when it is happening, and you can hopefully focus on some self-regulation in that moment to regulate back down again. But for our children and young people, what you'll see is some of those external behaviors. You're not going to necessarily see if they're salivating more or less, or if their palms are getting clammy, or if their heart rate's going up, or if they're feeling flushed. You might notice some signs, but what you might see is those classic overarching descriptions. So Jeremy's already commented on four of them. You might see the fight, the flight, the freeze, the fawn. And the other one that's sometimes referred to as the flop as well. And some people use the fifth one, some people don't. But it's a bit of a distinction between freeze and flop. Essentially, have they gone into hyperarousal or have they gone into hypoarousal? Essentially, for freeze, they might have completely physiologically frozen, but they might still actually be quite aware of what's going on and they're actually still quite alert to the perceived threat. Whereas with flop, they may very well just be completely shutting down. Muscles relax and completely shut down. The brain starts to shut down. The cortex shuts down. Emotionally, they might start shutting down. Heart rate might actually slow. Blood pressure might go down. There can actually be some subtle nuances and difference between freeze and flop. So sometimes people talk about it, some people don't. Um, Good way of thinking about it is just complete kind of disconnection and disassociation from what's happening in that moment. And so you might see the behaviors rather than the physiological. And the key to remember in all of that is that regardless of what you see in that moment, all of it has a meaning. All behavior has a meaning, whether it's our own behavior, whether it's the behavior of a child or young person. And it's remembering in a trauma informed way that we might only see the stuff on the surface. We might see some of those behaviors that sit within the classic fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop. You might see screaming and crying and shouting, and that might be the fight. Or you might see, complete withdrawal, which might be the flop or the freeze, but there's something going on below the surface. There's a stress response happening in that moment, and that stress response may be in response to something they're experiencing now, the adversity they're experiencing right now, or actually because there's bigger traumatic things happening for that child or young person. So, what we do in that moment is crucially important. You cannot control that child or young person. What they do in that moment, and especially if they're having a stress response, is very difficult well, you can't control, you can only try and influence. What's in your sphere of influence and what's in your sphere of control? The only thing that is in your sphere of control is yourself and your reaction. What's in your sphere of influence is then how you respond to that child or young person to try and influence them. And so we'll often talk about self-regulation and co-regulation. So am I aware, first and foremost? Am I self-aware of what my stress responses are? Am I aware of what my triggers are, the things that make me have a stress response? I'm aware how I normally react and behave in those situations. And am I able to self regulate? When I start to feel those things, do I have strategies to put in place to regulate myself? How we respond to the child or young person in that moment either has the potential to co regulate and help them start to regulate themselves, or has the potential to escalate. As Jeremy already mentioned, if you see that situation, how you respond can actually do more harm than good. Or are you responding in a way that is actually going to help them co-regulate and then do good? So what are some of those ones? And what I would love everyone to have a think about, just as we kind of progress into this last part of the webinar, is what are some of your activators or cues? Sometimes people talk about the language of triggers. I'm not a huge fan of that language, so I'll talk about activators or cues. What are the things that often give rise to a stress response in you? Everyone has them. One of my running jokes is that for my other half, it's the way I stack the dishwasher, but that's me just trying to be funny. There are different things. Sometimes it might be being challenged, being openly challenged in a classroom, for example. It might be someone, lying. It might be someone showing aggressive behaviors. It might be someone shouting. It might be all sorts of things that could be your activator or your cue. But what are they? Knowing what our activators or our cues are actually helps us then do the self-regulation before it's even started to have the stress response or right in the early stages of the stress response. So think about what your activators and cues are. Be aware of those. What are your signs of dysregulation? Is it the stomach? Do you feel it in the stomach? Is it the heat in your body? Is it the heart rate? Is it the hands? Is it the mouth? Is it the eyes? Where do you feel it first? And then when you do feel it, what do you do? And what we would say is that there's kind of three buckets. There's the dog joining in. She's having her stress response because she saw a cat out the window. Um, what we would say is there's kind of three buckets of strategies you can use when you're starting to feel dysregulated. So there's grounding strategies, connection strategies, and then support strategies. And you can teach this to yourself. You can work on these things yourself, and it takes time and it takes progress. I know certainly it's taken me a long time to practice some of these, and I'm still trying to practice and use these. But we can model this to our children and young people. We can show them that we're doing this. We can also teach it to them. We can teach this to our children and young people and start talking about regulation and being and stress responses and being aware of those. So when we are self-regulating, we can do these, but also that helps with co-regulation. So if I use these strategies when I'm trying to regulate myself, our children and young people will see these. You can do that physically. So sometimes it might be about moving closer, or sometimes it might actually be moving further away. Depends on the scenario and the situation. You show them connection, you show them through your external behaviors that you still want to be close to them, that you are calm, that you want to be connected. They will learn that, pick up on that too. And then you can use those support strategies. What's something you actually do in that moment that shows you're offering them some form of support? So a couple examples here. I'm sorry for all the text on the screen. I just really like when I get practical examples. So I thought I would share a couple for you. So when you feel your stress response, what grounding strategies do you use? And then this is where some of our mindfulness techniques come in beautifully. And I know many schools mindfulness has now become a big practice. But do you use things like your breathing? Do you focus on an element of your physical body in that moment? Do you use your breathing to just focus back in on what's happening with your body and calming and regulating your body back down again? So there's lots of great breathing exercises like a 4x4, box breathing, all sorts of different names for it, but essentially inhaling for four, holding for four, and exhaling for four. And I know that it might seem like sometimes when something's happening in a school environment or class environment, there's not time to do that. Actually, sometimes just going a bit quiet and focusing on your breathing again shows and models to our children and young people actually in this moment, I'm just going to ground myself and regulate myself, and that's okay. I think it's a more modern and better equivalent than just count to 10. Mum always used to say to me, just go away and count to 10. Maybe I'll do some box breathing instead. Maybe a feet body check in, trying to focus and be mindful of where are your feet right now? How are they feeling right now? What can they feel right now? Your posture. What's my body doing right now? And that's also thinking about those non-verbal physical cues we're giving to our children and young people. Just thinking in that moment, as I'm responding to the situation that might be unfolding in front of me, what is my body doing? Have I just gone completely tense? Because they will notice that. Unconsciously or consciously, they will notice if you've gone tense. Are your palms and hands clenched? Even if that's a stress response for you, that can give a very particular signal. Am I going to adjust my posture? Am I actually going to intentionally and deliberately open my hands and show open hands in that moment rather than clenched hands? Do you have an anchor phrase? Talking to yourself internally, your own internal monologue. I am safe. This isn't about me. I can respond to this. And sometimes just saying that inside your own head can be a really good grounding strategy. And the little self check in, what am I feeling right now? Even just pausing and going, what is my body doing right now? What am I feeling right now? Just brings you back into the current moment. And then your connection strategies. Show that young person that you want to support them in that moment using particular phrases. And again, Jeremy's touched on some of these already, which is beautiful alignment with what I'm talking about. But saying things like, I can see this is really hard for you. I'm here for you. We are safe. We've got this. Can we go closer? Instead of facing, it might actually be we stand alongside. Sometimes some of the most difficult conversations are actually really good to have side by side. Walking. I used to take kids for walks around the yard all the time and just walk with them. So we're both facing forward. We're not looking directly at each other because sometimes direct eye gaze can actually be really confrontational. But we're both facing somewhere. We're both walking to a particular direction and you can have a chat as you do that. Sometimes that's easier. Am I too close? Do I need to come back a bit? Should I move a little bit closer? Sometimes moving a little bit closer shows a child or young person that you want to connect with them. Is there a brief touch point as well? So, can you have a little chat afterwards, but making sure that we definitely follow it up and we follow through? And can we name what might be happening in that moment? And we can do this for ourselves, or self-regulation. We can also do this with a child, a young person. Naming is taming, as is often said. So it looks like you might be feeling. Not doing it in the affirmative. You are clearly, because that can be confrontational, especially if they don't agree with you. But it looks like you might be feeling overwhelmed. It looks like you might be feeling a bit stressed. It looks like you might be feeling frustrated. And then what do we use to support? Do we offer a gentle prompt? Sometimes it's a really calm redirection or kind of distraction prompt. So, hey, do you want to come back over here and look at this? Jeremy mentioned options. Oh, do you want to go over here and look at this thing, or would you like to go over here and look at this thing? That can make it easier for them because there's two choices. Go over here and do this, or go over here and do this. Complete distraction, completely change the topic. Can we go and do something else? Would you like to go and do this instead? Caring gesture. Sometimes it might be something like, would you like a drink of water? Would you like to go out for a drink of water? Would you like to sit over here and maybe sit closer to you? Sometimes it is just the soft eye contact, a softer smile as well. Not a big grin, because that could be weird in that moment, but just a softer smile, softer eye contact, open hands as well. We talked about choice, but also that idea of time in rather than time out. Can we just take a moment? So not sending them out, but maybe that, hey, would you like to take a moment? Giving them that agency over it and the ownership over it. But in that moment, how we respond is crucial. And this is exactly what might happen if you experience something that is challenging. It is maybe racist, like we've talked about. If you're trying to have challenging conversations in class and maybe a child or young person responds in a way that, could be. Adversity could be challenging for you, for others in that classroom. How do we tackle it appropriately and sensitively? So first and foremost, what are you doing? What am I feeling and thinking in this moment? So your self-awareness first. Then thinking about what's going on for that child or young person right now. What's happening for them? And what do they need from me? In this moment, they don't need me to probably challenge them. What they probably don't need right now is for me to escalate and shout at them and tell them off publicly in front of everyone. What they actually need from me right now is probably a calm, regulated response. And how do I do that? How do I best do that? And it can be the non-verbals, it can be the eye contact, the gestures, the body language, the posture, the facial expressions. Sometimes it might even be silence. Silence is powerful. And I know that was often one of my common go-tos in class when something happened. I'd just say nothing. Sometimes just saying nothing with a gentle gaze was enough to make a child go, oh, and de-escalate the situation. And then I could follow up with a conversation afterwards. Then I could go for a walk with them later in the day and have a chat about what was going on for them in that moment. And then the verbals as well. Do we use those gentle prompts? Do we provide choices? Do we respond with a caring statement or phrase as well? So first and foremost, you, and then what you do. If there's one thing that I would probably ask after this is thinking about, well, what are your activators and cues? So coming back to this, what are your activators and cues? Maybe in a school context and in a classroom, what are the common things that happen that make you have a stress response? What are your typical signs of a stress response, your physical signs, so that you know when you're starting to get stressed? And then what strategies do you use when you feel that? What grounding strategies do you use when you feel that? What connection strategies? What support strategies? And how can you apply the exact same things with your children and young people and model that and shape that with them? So as we come to kind of the end of this, and if you've got any questions for myself or Jeremy or both of us, I do want you to have a little think about and reflect on what have you heard this afternoon that has made you think differently about something? It might be something new, or it could have just changed your thinking about something. What's something you're feeling differently about? And what's something you could now take away and do differently and try to do differently and keep practicing? What are you thinking differently about? What are you feeling differently about? And what's something you could do differently after today? And with that, I'll bring us into the questions and getting close towards closing out. But before we do close out and handing it over to the people here in the room, and for those obviously watching the recording, if you have any questions, you're always more than welcome to reach out to us. I'm sure you can reach out to Jeremy if you have any questions about anti-racism pedagogy and about Click Against Hate and the amazing work there and the hundreds of resources. And you're always welcome to reach out to us at the Institute as well around trauma-informed practice. But if anyone here in the room has any questions, you are more than welcome to pop up your hand and speak verbally if you're comfortable doing so, or you're more than welcome to pop them in the chat and we'll take them from the chat. But you also don't have to either, only if you would like to. So we'll just give it a little moment and see if we've got any questions. And Jeremy, just while we do that, is there anything that you would add?
The only thing I was thinking about in your presentation was just how when you're thinking about yourself, um, is being aware of what other almost external stresses are impacting the way you're feeling. So not just what's in that moment, but perhaps there's things happening in your personal life that might also be impacting that you need to sort of be aware of, even when you walk into a classroom, ideally beforehand. And say, okay, this is how I'm feeling. This is what's going on. I need to like acknowledge it, maybe put it to the side if you can, compartmentalize it or something, but just at least, be aware of that as well.
Absolutely. That's it. We're all human. We're all human. We all have lives, and we all have lives outside of work and outside of school for our children, our young people, and us. And, it's hard to put those things to the side. We know that about our children and young people when they walk into a classroom, it's hard for them to put aside what might be happening for them at home or what's just happened in the yard or with a friend online. It's the same for us too. And it's, I think a key point of that as well is this also applies to our colleagues. How do we respond to our colleagues in a situation, that team meeting where maybe somebody's getting a little bit irate, and, might be a situation in a staff meeting, or there might be a colleague who's having a stress response, and then how we respond to that. We might go into stress response and not respond appropriately, and before we know it, it escalates.
And that also comes down to that misinterpretation as well. I know I had an incident where when I was teaching, we had a staff meeting, and I'm quite introverted most of the time, so pretty quiet. And that was interpreted by a colleague of mine as me being arrogant.
Mm,
And so that, I found out about that later on, and so we had to, try and resolve that, obviously. But yeah, it's just that misinterpretation. Interesting.
absolutely. And applying our own lenses and understandings to behavior. And we'll often talk about being non-judgmental. So thinking about that iceberg of behavior, what you see on the surface, trying really hard not to judge, not to apply your own lens. Because of our own experiences in life, we might apply a particular lens where we go, oh, well, if someone's quiet, that must mean that they are, X, when actually it could be the complete opposite of that for that person in that given moment in time.
And that's a key part of empathy, isn't it? Is that trying to refrain from judgment. So,
Mm, mm,
you know, yeah.
absolutely. Well, I can see there's maybe a couple of people typing in the chat. I'll just see if there's a question or whether it's a thank you so much. I think it's a thank you so much. You are very welcome. Thank you.
Yes, thank you,
Well,
Jenny.
well, on that, if there's no questions, that's been a minute or so to wait for any questions. But if there's no questions, we'll finish up there. You please, please, please check out Click Against Hate. If you haven't checked out their resources, please do, and you can sign up for free on the site and access all of those resources for free. Like Jeremy mentioned, it is a funded resource, so there's no cost to anyone to access those. And for us here at the Institute as well, you can check out our website and scan that QR code and check it out as well. But Jeremy, maybe back to you as well for a moment. Anything kind of final comments from you around Click Against Hate, or trying to flick back to one of your slides, but I think I've lost it. Anything from you on accessing any of your resources or anything?
Yeah, look, first of all, just say thank you. It's always fun and interesting doing these webinars with you. And in terms of Click Against Hate, yeah, look, it's all free, like I said, and we're happy to work with schools as well, whether it be pilot programs or case studies or whatever is happening. If you need a demonstration, can organise that. If you're in Melbourne, we can organise to come and visit, whatever it may be. There's a lot happening with us, so please connect and send me, an email or call, and we can take it further from there.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And thank you to everyone who came along and joined us this afternoon. Thank you for giving us some of your time. And thank you to all those who are watching the recording as well. Thank you for giving it your time, and we really appreciate it. Go well. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Have a think about some self-care tonight. How are you going to look after yourself tonight and have some downtime and relaxation time? And hopefully we will see you all again soon at another event. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.